let's jump right into a really exciting question. It's a concept that's captivated millions, sparked endless theological debates, and even inspired blockbuster movies. But what exactly is the rapture? And, when is it actually supposed to happen?
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a super fun journey back to its ancient roots. We'll look strictly at historical and biblical texts to see how this incredible idea grew into a huge cornerstone of modern theology and popular culture. We've got a great roadmap for our explainer today. First, defining the rapture concept. Second, Darby and the dispensationalist shift. Third, tracing the historical roots. Fourth, Israel, church, and prophecy. Fifth, pre, mid, or post-tribulation. And finally, denominational stances today.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, defining the rapture concept.
So here's a totally surprising fact to start us off. The word rapture itself, it doesn't actually appear anywhere in English Bible translations. No way, right? Instead, the whole concept comes from the Latin text, specifically the word rapio, which means a carrying off, a transport, or a sudden joyful snatching away of believers from the earth. At its heart, this is just an incredibly joyful, happy promise. Think of it through the eyes of a child for a second. It's this exciting, comforting idea that one day, believers will literally be caught up in the clouds to meet Jesus in the air. And then, they get to be with God forever. It's really meant to be a doctrine completely full of hope.
And 1 Corinthians builds on this beautiful promise with the amazing detail of an instantaneous transformation. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. Just imagine that. Faster than you can even blink, believers are given glorified bodies, completely free from any sin or pain. It's this miraculous event getting everyone perfectly prepared for eternity.
Moving right along to Section 2, Darby and the dispensationalist shift. Meet John Nelson Darby. He was a brilliant Irishman who graduated with highest honors from Trinity College way back in 1819. Today, he's widely considered the father of modern dispensationalism. In the 1830s, he really popularized the idea of a secret pre-tribulation rapture. Basically, he believed God had very distinct plans for human history, dividing it all up into different eras, or dispensations. Now, Darby's specific method was applying a highly literal approach to unfulfilled prophecy. Because he believed the current church age was going to end in moral ruin and apostasy, he argued that a distinct, secret rescue mission, the rapture, was absolutely required to save the church. Okay, let's dive into Section 3, tracing the historical roots. So, you might be wondering, did Darby just invent this concept out of thin air in the 19th century? Well, actually, rudimentary features of dispensationalism and rapture theology existed centuries before him. We can trace threads of this back to the early church fathers between AD 110 and 304, who wrote about distinct ages, and later to 1687 when Pierre Porre wrote about the decay of the church. In fact, recent scholarly research highlights writings from figures like Morgan Edwards in 1744. He actually wrote about a rapture happening 3.5 years before the millennium. There are even older texts, like a sermon by Pseudo-Ephraim, showing pre-tribulation rapture concepts where believers are gathered prior to a great tribulation to escape worldly confusion. So the seeds were definitely there long before Darby's era. Let's keep exploring in Section 4, Israel, Church, and Prophecy. At the absolute core of all this theological conflict is how to view Israel and the church. Critics, who often hold to covenant theology, argue that physical Israel was basically replaced by spiritual Israel in the New Testament, meaning the church is the new Israel. Dispensationalists, conversely, argue that God has completely separate, distinct plans for physical Israel and the church. For them, this makes a rapture totally necessary to remove the church so God can finish his promises to national Israel. Which brings us to a really big question in Section 5, pre, mid, or post-tribulation. When it comes to the prophesied 7-year tribulation period, there are 3 primary timelines people look at. Pre-tribulationists believe the rapture happens before the 7 years. Mid-tribulationists believe it happens halfway through, so believers escape the worst of it. And post-tribulationists, they believe it happens at the very end, meaning the rapture and the second coming of Christ are exactly the same event. When analyzing the scriptural arguments for these views, pre-tribulationists point out a truly fascinating detail. The church isn't explicitly mentioned after chapter 3 of the book of Revelation. For them, this strongly implies the church has already been joyfully raptured to heaven to escape the wrath unfolding in all those later chapters.
On the flip side, post-tribulationists point right to Matthew chapter 24. They argue the return won't be a secret snatching away at all, noting that lightning shines visibly from east to west for everyone to see. Furthermore, they point out that God has historically preserved believers through persecution, not necessarily removed them from it, highlighting that the elect are gathered by angels only after the tribulation has ended.
Let's wrap up our deep dive with Section 6, Denominational Stances Today.
While the pre-tribulation rapture is incredibly popular in Western media, think of all those best-selling books and movies, many major global denominations actually officially reject it. Groups like the Continental Reformed, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Seventh-day Adventists, and Latter-day Saints view the secret pre-tribulation rapture as a modern doctrine. Instead, they teach that believers will remain on earth through varying degrees of tribulation.
But here is a really wonderful, comforting takeaway. Despite all the theological friction across different churches, ministries like Focus on the Family emphasize a highly unifying point. They state that whether you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, a post-tribulation return, or something else entirely, having the exact right timeline is not an indispensable essential for salvation. We'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. Isn't it just truly fascinating how different lenses on a few ancient verses can construct entirely different worldviews, spawning massive cultural phenomenons and deeply held joyful hopes? Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer today. Keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you next time.